In 1901, one man wrote down a single number on a scrap of paper and walked away with more money than the United States government had in its treasury. His name was Andrew Carnegie, and this is the true story of how a dirt-poor immigrant kid became the richest man on earth. To really understand Andrew Carnegie, you have to go back to the freezing winter of 1835 in Dunfermline, Scotland. He was born in a tiny one-room stone cottage that his family shared with another family. His father, Will Carnegie, was a proud handloom weaver who spent endless hours weaving fine damask linens by hand. His family believed deeply in political rights, regular worker protests, and radical ideas about human equality. Young Andrew grew up listening to his uncle give fiery political speeches on street corners about the rights of the common worker. Everything changed when massive steam-powered factory machines arrived in town and wiped out the handloom weaving trade almost overnight. Suddenly, Will Carnegie had no work, and the family found themselves starving with no real future in sight. His mother, Margaret, sold sweet treats and mended old shoes, just to keep enough food on the table. By 1848, things were so bad that the family decided to sell their last possessions and borrow money to buy boat tickets to America. They landed in Allegheny, Pennsylvania, just outside Pittsburgh, looking for any kind of fresh start they could find. Pittsburgh back then was a dark, smoky town covered in soot from coal fires, and it was hard for new immigrants to survive. Young Andrew was only 12 years old, but he had to jump straight into the workforce to help pay the rent. His very first job was working as a bobbin boy in a loud cotton mill, earning just $1.20 a week. He worked 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, in a dark and humid room filled with lint and screaming machines. Think about that for a second. At 12 years old, he was already pulling 72-hour work weeks just to help feed his family. Soon after, he moved to a job firing the boiler in a factory basement, which was dangerous and completely terrifying for a young kid. He knew he needed to escape that dark basement, so he kept his eyes open for any new chance. That opportunity came when he landed a position as a telegraph messenger boy in downtown Pittsburgh. This job changed his entire life because it brought him out of the factories and into the center of the business world. Andrew made sure he memorized every single street, every major business address, and the names of all the top city leaders. When important men walked through the doors, young Andrew greeted them by name and delivered their messages faster than anyone else. He also taught himself how to operate the telegraph equipment during his spare moments early in the morning. Back then, most operators had to slowly read the dots and dashes from a paper tape that fed through a noisy printer. Andrew practiced until he could translate the clicking sounds of Morse code straight from the air just by listening. He was only the third person in the entire country who could listen to the wire and write down messages in real time. During these busy years, he found another secret weapon that gave him an edge over everyone around him. A local man named Colonel James Anderson opened his private library of 400 books to working boys every single Saturday. Andrew read every single book he could get his hands on, studying history, science, literature, and practical business. That simple act of generosity made a permanent mark on him and gave birth to a dream he would fulfill decades later. By 1853, an executive named Thomas A. Scott at the Pennsylvania Railroad noticed the clever young telegraph operator. Scott hired the 18-year-old Andrew as his personal secretary and telegrapher for $35 a month. Working on the railroad was like going to the greatest business school in the world. Scott became Andrew's primary mentor, showing him how modern corporations managed complex logistics and massive budgets. He also taught young Carnegie how the stock market worked and encouraged him to make his very first financial investments. Andrew bought shares in the Adams Express Company, and when his first $10 dividend check arrived, his mind was blown. He realized right then that having your money work for you was far better than only working with your two bare hands. When the American Civil War broke out in 1861, Scott was called to Washington to organize military transportation for the Union. Andrew went with him, helping to rebuild ruined rail lines and manage the critical military telegraph network. He saw firsthand how vital iron, trains, and instant communication were to the survival of the entire nation. He also noticed that that old wooden bridges along the rail lines kept catching fire from engine sparks or collapsing under heavy train cars. Andrew realized that America was about to rebuild its entire infrastructure using strong, durable iron instead of cheap wood. In 1865, he took a giant gamble and launched the Keystone Bridge Company to replace fragile wooden bridges with iron ones. He also poured money into sleeping car companies for luxury rail travel and bought stakes in booming Pennsylvania oil fields. By the time he was 30 years old, his smart investments were bringing in over $50,000 a year. That was a huge fortune back in the 1860s, but Andrew was not even close to being finished. During a trip to England in the early 1870s, he visited a steel mill and saw something that completely stopped him in his tracks. He watched the Bessemer process in action, where blasts of cold air turned molten pig iron into super strong steel in minutes. Before this invention, making good steel took days, cost a small fortune, and could only be produced in tiny batches. Carnegie looked at that glowing converter and instantly knew that the old age of iron was completely dead. He rushed back home to Pennsylvania and bet his entire life savings on building the biggest steel plant America had ever seen. In 1875, he opened the massive Edgar Thomson Steel Works in Braddock, Pennsylvania, naming it after the president of the railroad. Carnegie was obsessed with cutting costs, tracking every single penny of production down to the fourth decimal place. Other steel bosses focused on selling at high prices, but Carnegie focused only on making steel cheaper than anyone else on Earth. If steel cost $50 a ton to make, he figured out a way to produce it for $20 a ton. He then plowed all his profits straight back into buying newer, bigger, and faster machinery while his rivals grew lazy. He also created what business experts now call vertical integration, which gave him total control over the entire supply chain. Carnegie did not want to pay a middleman for anything, so he bought iron ore fields around Lake Superior. He bought vast coal mines and coke ovens in Pennsylvania to provide all the heat needed for his giant blast furnaces. He bought his own fleet of steamships to carry ore across the Great Lakes and his own railway lines to haul it to his mills. By 1892, he combined all these massive assets into the giant Carnegie Steel Company, dominating the American industrial landscape. His mills produced more steel than the entire country of Great Britain, feeding the rapid rise of modern American cities. Every skyscraper in Chicago, every train track heading west, and the Brooklyn Bridge itself were built using Carnegie steel. He was hailed as the greatest industrial genius of his time, but a dark storm was brewing inside his own factories. Carnegie publicly claimed to love the working man, writing articles that supported unions and fair living wages. He loved to brag about his humble beginnings as a poor weaver's boy and promised he would never replace workers during strikes. Behind closed doors, however, he placed a ruthless manager named Henry Clay Frick in direct charge of running the mills. Carnegie wanted maximum profits, and Frick was determined to smash the union at the giant Homestead steel plant once and for all. In the summer of 1892, while Carnegie was away at a remote castle in Scotland, Frick announced major wage cuts. When the workers refused the cuts, Frick locked thousands of men out of the plant and built a massive fence with barbed wire. The workers took over the entire town to protect their jobs and keep replacement workers from entering the property. Frick responded by hiring 300 armed Pinkerton detectives who arrived on barges in the middle of the dark night. A massive gun battle broke out along the riverbank, resulting in multiple deaths, dozens of injuries, and national outrage. The state governor sent in 8,000 armed militia troops to restore order and protect the plant. The union was completely crushed. The men were forced back to work for less pay, and many strike leaders were blacklisted forever. Even though Carnegie was thousands of miles away in Scotland, the public blamed him for turning his back on his own workforce. His carefully crafted image as the friend of the common working man was shattered, and the stain never fully washed away. As the 19th century came to a close, Carnegie began looking for a graceful way to step down from his industrial empire. The legendary banker J.P. Morgan wanted to merge all the major steel producers into one gigantic national trust. In 1901, Carnegie took a scrap of paper, wrote $480 million on it, and sent it to Morgan. Morgan looked at the number accepted the terms instantly without bargaining, and congratulated Carnegie on becoming the richest man in the world. Carnegie personally took home over $300 million from that historic sale, which equals billions in today's money. That massive merger created the United States Steel Corporation, the very first billion-dollar company in human history. Now Andrew was faced with a brand new challenge. What do you do with more money than any human could ever spend? Years earlier, in 1889, he had written a famous essay called The Gospel of Wealth, laying out his personal moral code. He argued that a rich man was merely a trustee for the public, responsible for using his surplus wealth to help society. In that famous essay, he wrote one of his most memorable lines: "The man who dies rich, dies disgraced." He spent the remaining 18 years of his life giving away 90% of his colossal fortune with incredible focus. Remembering the kind man who opened his private library to poor boys in Allegheny, Carnegie poured millions into public education. He funded the construction of over 2,500 free public libraries across the English-speaking world. He built world-class research centers, including the Carnegie Institution for Science and the Carnegie Institute of Technology. He also built Carnegie Hall in New York City, creating a world-class stage for the finest musicians on earth. In his final years, he became deeply devoted to world peace, building the Grand Peace Palace in The Hague. He truly believed that educated nations could settle their political differences through international arbitration instead of bloody wars. When World War I erupted across Europe in 1914, the brutal conflict broke his heart and crushed his spirit. Andrew Carnegie passed away in Massachusetts in 1919 at the age of 83, having given away over $350 million. He left behind a complex legacy as both a hard-nosed industrialist and the greatest modern philanthropist the world had ever seen.
Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe. It really helps us.